Whoa, what the hell is happening to your computer screen? Is it reading your thumbs up? Will that happen to me too? I don't think I've... Listener, Chris Bagg was giving double thumbs up. But verbalize your feelings for this podcast. But that was enough for the Iron Eagle.
Yeah.
In Iron Eagle.
Great pair. There were two movies. There might have been a third Iron Eagle.
Was there an Iron Eagle 2?
There's definitely two. There's definitely.
Wow.
I believe so. I
was so excited to see that when it came out.
And
it's not very good. It's the combat in it is nowhere near as good as Top Gun.
Correct. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. 1988 was Iron Eagle 2. Was there an Iron Eagle 3? There was 1992.
Something called Iron Eagle on the Attack.
Oh gosh, 14
with Lou Gossett Jr. So it's like, oh yeah, definitely
14% on Rotten Tomatoes. You have to you have to work pretty hard to get down that low on Rotten Tomatoes. That essentially means that there's like 2 people who enjoyed Iron Eagle 3.
Well, Hollywood loves sequels.
It's true. Is there 4? Oh my God.
Yeah, there is.
Iron Eagle on the Attack. You're right. Yeah. How long?
As opposed to the other movies, which were Iron Eagle on the Defense.
Mm-hmm. No, it appears that we run out at Iron Eagle on the Attack. But yes, a 1995 direct-to-video action film directed by Sidney J. Furie. Wow.
Sidney J. Furie, what a name. I'm just imagining, like, to transition to the topic at hand, like, The City and the City 2. Or like, what would they? The City and the City and the City? And the City. Would that be?
Well, which is kind of like, there is a moment in the book when I was like, is it 4 cities? Because I was like, we've got Bej, we've got Ulcoma. Like, there's this moment when you start thinking that there really is a like conflict between Breach and Orsini.
Yeah. So you got 4 cities.
Oh, no, what? And then unfortunately it ends up that this is just it's just like corporate skullduggery is like the reveal is that the end of it is like, nope.
It was capitalism all along.
Capitalism. That's the title. Oh my God. That is 100% the title. It was capitalism all along.
I just to note, often in the podcast you're wrong about that is a joke in that particular podcast. Often the hosts reach a point where they say it was capitalism all along. Well, so this is part 2 of The City and the City, and it begins when Borlu, who's now operating in Ulcoma with his counterpoint Qasim Dot, gets a tip that the same unionist who contacted him the first time, he gets another tip who is now scared. This person is getting the hell out of town, but he claims that Geary was killed because she, quote, found Orsini, the third city. And he seems to really believe it. And then pretty shortly after that, Borlu trails the security guard at the archaeological dig and finds the other missing student, fortunately alive and well, Yolanda Rodriguez. He then recruits, she's terrified. She also thinks that Geary had found Orsini, and Borlu and Dot are starting to sort of maybe think that too, although they both are sort of like, that's ridiculous. But then at one point, they're sort of both like, but it's the only thing that really makes sense at this point, because clearly there is some antagonistic force out there that is secretive. That seems to be able to operate in both Ulcoma and Bezel. So Borlu recruits Dot to help him spirit Rodriguez out of Ulcoma and into Bezel, but because Borlu thinks that in Bezel he can help her with his contacts, like escape both cities and get back to, I think, Canada or United States. So Dot is annoyed and agrees to help, and they start smuggling her out of the city, and I'll let you take over.
Yeah, in like a real moment of deciding not to engage plot armor, Poor Yolanda Rodriguez is just shot and killed during this extraction. A sniper shows up and sort of very cleverly assassinates her kind of through Copula Hall. And so the shooter is safe because he is in Basel, and at the moment they're still in Olcoma. But because the like crime itself happens in Copula Hall, it's kind of this like extraterritorial space, and he's going to get away. And Borlu, sort of in a fit of like really wanting to get his man and to get justice for Mahalia Giri and now Yolanda Rodriguez, chases the sniper and shoots him dead from Olcoma into Bagel, thereby breaching, and he is kidnapped. He is taken by breach. And we move into the third part of the book, which, as you pointed out last time, is simply called Breach. The first two parts, there was Bagel, Olcoma, and now we have Breach. He spends the rest of the novel being in Breach. There's so much fun play with like breach of contract. You're in Breach. You have breached. Like, again, like we talked last time about the genius of Cleave, but he really gets even more mileage out of Breach and the different uses this time. And Borlu manages to convince his third sidekick, a breach, an avatar of Breach named Ashel, that even though Borlu has breached and has committed a crime, he is onto something, and he begins to realize that Breach is also worried about this other force, whatever it might be, whether it's Orsini or something else. They're actually scared as well. And he realizes that he can maybe leverage that fear into continuing his investigation. And they do that. There's some times where Borlu kind of gets like locked back up in his like breach cell, but he's given some ways that he can work on the case. They go to a library, they find Mahalia's notes, and they begin to get to the bottom of this whole situation, which involves some stolen artifacts. Basically, Giri was stealing artifacts from this archaeological dig. She thought she was funneling them to Orsini, but it turns out, and I'll kick it back to you for the end.
Turns out that it was capitalism all along. It wasn't this mysterious third city. It wasn't a secretive, hidden from view conspiracy. It was a overt, hidden in plain sight capitalist conspiracy. There's this American corporation, Cyr and Core, and I think with Bowden's help, they tricked her into thinking they were actually agents of Orsini, that they owned the artifacts that she was digging up, and she had to repatriate them. But really, they just wanted them because they have some very strange, very advanced technology. This is like the weird fiction part of the book. Like the technology is kind of steampunk, even though it is from 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. Very strange stuff.
There's a lot of gears and levers and bladders and stuff like that.
Right, but also minutely, machined in a way that most people did not think that humans had the ability to 1,000 years ago. So then we also learned that the ultra-nationalists in Basel were involved as muscle for Cyr and Core in some way. They think they're stealing the artifacts for Basel, and that's how they're sort of roped in. So Borlu and a breach avatar named Achille confront Cyr and Core. I forget the name of the person who they confront there.
Burrich, I think.
Yeah.
Or Cedar?
It doesn't really matter.
You're right. It doesn't really matter.
They confront the Cyr and Core guy and the Basel politician. One escapes. They shoot the other one. And then Achille is wounded. And also, the other thing that's happening is there's sort of a massive breach going on, a riot that's been started by the Unionists, but that's also giving cover to the ultranationalists. So at this point, Achille, who has been kind of like Borlu's proctor, his minder. You refer to him as a sidekick, and that's sort of true, but he's really also his mentor. Basically gives his gun, which is this weird space age gun, and badge to Borlu, and then it's like, go get David Bowden, because they figured out that Bowden was also involved in this whole thing and probably killed Geary.
Yeah.
So Borlu recruits his two former sidekicks who go to the same physical location but cannot look at one another because that would be breach. And they find Bowden, who is managing to convey that he might be in either city in such a way that nobody can arrest him because they might breach if they do. But then Borlu, because he's already in breach, is able to arrest David Bowden after having a very Philip Marlowe, like, I know why you did it, sort of conversation with him, brings him into breach, and then we get this epilogue where we learn Borlu's fate, if you want to give that to us.
And Borlu's fate is that once you're in breach, it's the Hotel California. You can never leave. And it's and for sort of somewhat good reason.
But do they stab him with their steely knives?
They do not. They do not stab him with their steely knives. He gets to kind of say goodbye to Dat and Corwy, though the goodbye is kind of a like, they can sort of acknowledge a shape of him. And he sort of raises a hand, but he's faced away from them, so they can't really say that it's breach. And he becomes an avatar of breach himself. He asks some questions like, "Can I leave?" And Achille is sort of like, "You can't. Because if you leave, you're in breach, and then you're ours." And you become something called an insile. You have been exiled inside the cities, which is another just wonderful creation in this.
Insile, yeah, it's a great term.
And we have justice for Mahalia Geary, in that David Bowden is brought to justice. That's the book.
So I had a reading that I wanted to do, but I realized I queued the wrong reading. So do you want to ask your first question first, and I'll get my correct reading?
Yeah, totally. Okay, so we have 3 sections of this book, and you are totally correct. Achille is kind of mentor, teacher, whatnot, but he serves the same purpose that Corwy and Dot have served, which is like, well, we need somebody to bounce ideas off of. There's kind of this like sounding board structure.
Especially because Borlu has a lot of flashes of insight in this book. He
sure does, yeah.
And he's kind of ahead of everybody in piecing things together, and he needs somebody to explain it to.
Yeah, totally. And, like the end of The Long Goodbye, you and I found sort of Baroque in its kind of plotting. This is less complicated, but it's also very intellectually complicated. And I was wondering if by the time we get to Achille, that you're a little sick of this sidekick sounding board structure. Did the seams start to show for you?
Not in that respect.
Okay.
I think I was so fascinated by breach that I didn't mind that. And well, maybe though, because when Achille first shows up, I found him super fascinating. And the thing that I found really interesting about those first couple chapters that were in breach, let's see, the thing that I found super fascinating, I loved how they worked. Just the logistics of how they operated. They used, it was kind of like what people were saying about Orsini. They used buildings where nobody knew, the people in Bejel thought they were Olcoma, and the people in Olcoma thought they were Bejel. And we get a couple moments where breach is described in how they basically are invisible. And basically they go about in clothes that could be either Bezel or Ulcoma, and they walk in such a way that doesn't quite place them in either.
Yeah.
So that which is very similar to what Bowden does at the end, so that if you're in Bezel and you see someone in Breach, you have to unsee them because you think they're in Ulcoma.
Yeah.
And vice versa. So they are kind of functionally invisible, but then they can kind of reveal themselves, by just changing their posture, which is sort of fascinating. And you realize they operate through intimidation. They mostly, when they have to, they don't have any, they have, it's like, rather than have like really impressive technology, they have like beat up old 486 computers, but they like probably have really good tech guys.
Yeah.
Because, but it's nothing fancy. It doesn't look like you're watching like a spy movie with like fancy computers, or it's more like watching slow horses, like dusty old files. And so the way they operate is super fascinating. But then, I guess to your point, I wasn't so much annoyed about the sidekickness of Ashiel. I just was like, all the twists and turns at that point, I was just like, this is now boring.
Yeah.
Like now, like once we started unraveling, okay, what's really going on here? Oh, she was stealing artifacts at the dig. There's this fascinating scene where Borlu sort of mimes how she would steal them by like taking them into this park that's in Ulcoma and dropping them in a crosshatch space, and then somebody in Bezel would pick them up. And I just like, I had to read that part over and over again, and like the part with Searing Core. So I did get bored around the same time, but for me, I didn't identify it as the thing you're describing. The thing you're describing is the thing that was designed to like solve the problem. I just thought it was too Byzantine and boring.
Yeah.
I was completely fascinated by Breach. I was completely fascinated by Orsini. I mean, okay, China Miéville, this is his point, right? We have all sorts of conspiratorial thinking, but we need to look no longer than the very obvious structure of our capitalistic, corporate world to find the real enemy. I get it. That's the point he's making. It's an interesting point. It's a good point. But it's kind of, after introducing the idea of like warfare between the four cities, it's a little bit of a letdown, I found.
Yeah, 100%. And maybe we're getting to the letdown in different ways. It really, maybe for me, it's the like seeing the strings that made the magic go out of it a little bit, which is a bummer because usually for me, like being a theater person, seeing the strings only heightens the magic. Like being able to see the stuff helps me. But for some reason, this was just such an obvious literary device. Like, we got like, okay, we have this incredibly complicated metaphysical plot, and a very complicated kind of physical plot. And I was just like, man, does he just meet people and then like after a little while of kind of like a very short amount of time kind of win their trust, and then they're willing to sort of bend over backwards for him for a lot of things? Like both Dat and Corwy like seem very in danger of losing their jobs.
Yeah, I mean, I buy all three of those. Corwy, I think we just get that she is an eager, competent young cop who admires Borlu because he's smart.
Yeah.
And she also treats him like she's smart.
And it's a trope. And so, we're used to that trope. We're used to this setup.
Sure, but I feel like in sort of boringly bureaucratic institutions, if a talented older mentor befriends a talented younger person who's underrated, like usually that will stimulate loyalty. So that makes sense to me.
Oh yeah.
I think Dot, once he decides that, I think that what we're supposed to understand about Dot is that once he decides that Borlu is really trying to solve the case and he's bonded with him, he has a kind of like loyalty code. He's like, you know what? I don't care about anything else. Borlu's on the level, so I'm not going to snitch on him. I'm going to do what he needs me to do. It's basically like I'm not going to let my partner down, even if that means taking my girlfriend's cell phone.
That's right. That is a great scene.
And then I guess if I'm going to push back on you, maybe you're just more clear at seeing it. But I think what would make it work, if it works, is Borlu's predicament. And then when you realize, Ashiel's actually kind of relying on Borlu to figure this out. I mean, the stakes are at this point, we don't know it. we later learn that all along Achille was probably had it in mind to recruit Borlu into Breach. At one point he says, we were thrilled that we were breached because we're not very good detectives. And we were thrilled when you breached. Yeah. And so you get the sense that what's actually happening is a kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? A probationary period where they're trying him out, and he's probably not in as much danger as Achille is hinting at. Breach does a lot of their work through intimidation and fear. They're not really as scary as they pretend to be. And we also learn that all of Breach is staffed by people who breached. Yeah. And so it seems like actually if you breach in some way that is like not egregious, not like a murder breach, not like a smuggling breach, but a sort of like, you know, a sort of more innocent breach, that likely they'll just bring you into their organization and you get to work with them. We don't know what happens to the people who murder breach. I get the sense that they're probably just killed, or maybe they're exiled to another country and sworn to secrecy or something. You know, that we do see people get exiled. Actually, the parents.
This, let's see. Now there's this. They provide a very fun Are you familiar with the way the British Navy worked? If what would be the rum sodomy and the lash version of breach? Like what would we add to rum sodomy and the lash?
Well, just to be clear, I think only the lash is considered a punishment in those in those three. But I guess if you're gonna say like, it's like you join us, we kill you, or we send you to Siberia. Right. You know, it's something.
There's definitely a joke that we could workshop in there, but yeah.
Well, I found the passage that I wanted to share with you, and I think it ties to your question too. So I want to know, when you read this passage for the first time, how you felt. So this is when both Dot and Borlu, it's on page 211. This is when Dot and Borlu are talking to Yolanda. 1 second. I want to make sure I want to set it up properly. Come on, I interrupted. She's talking about, she's scared of Orsini, and they suggest, well, maybe you should just breach, and then they'll eject you, and you'll be fine. And at one point, Borlu says, come on, I interrupted. You must know most foreigners who breach are just ejected. But she interrupted back. Even if I knew what they do, which neither of us do, think about it. A secret for like more than 1,000 years, in between Ulcoma and Bezel, watching us all the time, whether we know it or not, with its own agenda. You think I'd be safer if Breach had me? In the Breach? I'm not Mahalia. I'm not sure Orsini and the Breach are enemies at all. She looked at me, and then I did not disdain her. Maybe they work together. Or maybe, when you invoke, you've been handing power to Orsini for centuries, while you all sit here telling each other it's a fairy tale. I think Orsini is the name Breach calls itself. How did you feel when you read that?
Whoa, look at those.
Whoa, what the hell is happening to your computer screen? Is it reading your thumbs up? Will that happen to me too? I don't think I
know that works on the iPhone. I didn't know that Zoom had that ability. That's incredible. I love that it's blurred out. So like these like blurry.
Listener, Chris Bagg was giving double thumbs up. But verbalize your feelings for this podcast.
So this moment, I was like, I am more in than ever. I am so excited for this like unraveling of like now, like, because the whodunit kind of like moves up to this very like metaphysical place. Like this was this moment where I was like, I'm reading a crime novel that is also a John Keats poem. Like it just, I was so excited for this to be the possibility that there is this like mislabeling, maybe Orsini and Breach are working together. The nature, it fits so perfectly with like the nature of reality, which is what this book really does seem to be about before it is just capitalism all along. And like, I loved this passage, and I felt that same sort of like gathering dread of like, oh fuck, like what is this?
So what if this wasn't a red herring? What if what Yolanda is proposing here was in fact the secretive breach? Which book is better, the actual book or the hypothetical this is not a red herring book?
Well, now, I mean, like, you know what would be great if it would happen right now is that if you like pulled up a like copy of like a different The City in the City and you were like, well, Chris, the experience that people get when you read The City in the City the first time is that you are let in on the joke, and then you have to manipulate somebody else into reading The City in the City. They get a little disappointed by the "it was capitalism all the time" thing.
Or what if I were to say,
reveal to them?
What if I were to say, are you sure it ended with Siren Core? Check your edition. It may have changed. And then you looked at the book, and it was a different book, and it had changed since the first time you read it.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, I was so under the spell of this setup that like really you could have sold me that was like that we were going to head in some very outlandish non-fiction, non-plot, non-book, post-narrative thing that I was like, oh hell yes. Like I was like, that's what I want. I wanted to go deeper into the conflict and the idea of what is Breach and what is Orsini. And I was really, and I think this kind of goes to my next question, you know, which is essentially like the realities of plot, like the necessary realities of plot when run up against just the magnificence of this idea. Like, is there a certain point where like a book is not the correct medium for this idea?
Oh, no, I think what's going on here is that China Miéville is actually saying to us, you want this to be a metaphysical novel, and it actually isn't.
Are you saying it's intentional?
I am. I
yes.
I think I am, you know, among the upper middle brows, I am the skeptic of it's intentional. Sometimes I am often the one who's like, nah, I think they just got up and wrote something that day and they stuck with it.
Yeah.
But I think China Miéville wanted both of us to feel exactly what you just described at that moment. And then I think he wanted to pull that rug out from under us.
Ouch.
I think that's 100% intentional. And I think he wanted to pull that rug, and then he wanted the back of our metaphorical reader heads to slam into the concrete floor that is capitalism as China Miéville sees it.
Yeah.
I think that's what he wanted, and I can't disrespect that. A, because it's kind of a cool move. It's kind of a D move, but it's also kind of a cool move. And it's his book, man. And like, what do I have if not respect for the writer's vision? But I will say that I did not enjoy the book so much as I did at that moment. Mm-hmm. And then the second moment is the very earliest, that chapter when Borlu breaches, I thought was wonderful. Mm-hmm. And then the first chapter in Breach, I thought was wonderful. When we're just like, or the first couple, when you're recognizing how a breach works. And then I just felt like it went into a slow decline. So, you know, because he wanted to do that movement, but then he had to tie up all the plot threads. Yep. And so then you have to have Borlu and Achille go around to the archaeological dig, and they have to go, and then the riot has to happen, and they have to go up on the roof, and all of that. I found it wasn't like anything. Well, you've identified something wrong with the writing, which is that you felt like the exposition became tropey in the use of the device. I didn't find anything in particular wrong at the sentence level. I just was like, this just feels like reading the end of Red Harvest to me. You know, you just but I don't know what to make of it, because I think that is exactly what China Miéville intended. I think that's what he intended.
I really thought we were in the end of Lethal Weapon. When he is on top of the building, when we're having the showdown with the Bejel crook and the man from Sear and Coke. And the man from Sear and Coke is just going on and on about like
diplomatic immunity.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was like, oh my God.
So you're actually referring to Lethal Weapon 3, I should say.
I wasn't sure. I was like, was that 2 or is that the one with the toilet bomb? I couldn't quite remember. But gosh, that's really, that one is Lethal Weapon 3. Man.
I think so. Maybe it's Lethal Weapon 2. Maybe it's 2 because 2 did have the other German neo-Nazi types. Mm-hmm. I actually think it is 2 because I actually think 3 was an improvement because that's the one where you get Rene Russo. Mm-hmm. And like it kind of picks up a little bit, I think, with her.
You get more underwater shoulder dislocations.
Just the one, I think.
Yeah, which is basically a narrative masterstroke.
Well, in all of those movies, there's always a moment early on where one of them does something pretty incredible in a training scene, and then the first version of that is Murtaugh shooting the guy right between the eyes in the range, and then when the truck's bearing down on him in the alley, making the same shot, and you're like, yeah. We know he could do it. We saw him do it in the range. Yeah. The other moment like that was the armor-piercing rounds shooting through the. Those movies are masterful plotting movies. Mm-hmm. Even though they are ridiculous, unrealistic stories. Also, like Mel is a crazy person, but he'll never let you down. Like Wild Eye, in terms of Wild Eye intensity, like Mel Gibson. Nobody does wild-eyed intensity like Mel Gibson.
He's a great actor of individual moments. Like he does like momentary, the word is escaping me at the moment, but like if you need someone to do a thing in a moment, he is your man.
Yep. And I would say he's had a handful of good character study movies too. But that's more hit and miss. But anyway, we're not here to talk about Mel Gibson.
Aren't we?
Although, actually, that reminds me of a question, which is, who would you cast as the Theodore Borlu, Qasim Dot, and Corway?
Gosh, is it too much? Am I too much in the same world to just kind of be like Ed Norton is like a perfect Borlu because of Motherless Brooklyn? Like he does that like he does that kind of like off the cuff noir detective pretty well. Like that's my first impulse, but I'm sure there's other. Liam Neeson wafted through my brain and was then instantly rejected. Too tall, too masculine. I kind of wanted to be Humphrey Bogart.
I was thinking Clive Owen.
Oh, he'd be great. Yeah.
Clive Owen as Borlu, but Clive Owen could also be Dot. But then I think Dot should be more of a bruiser. Like Dot could be like Jason Statham.
Or Jet from Cowboy Bebop. I mean, we're getting weird.
That's
now,
not an actor.
Sure, what? Get out of here.
It's true. Doesn't Jet like dress up as a waiter one time?
I'm sure.
Yeah.
But what I want,
Lori Petty as like 90s Lori Petty as Corwin. Yeah,
this would be great. What I want for Borlu is like, I mean, like the reason I say Sam Spade and Humphrey Bogart is like because he fits really nicely in that canon of like very effective rule breakers.
Yeah.
In that kind of like slightly down at the heel, like you really do get the sense that Borlu kind of wanders around Bejel in like an Eastern European trench coat and fedora. Like that's what it feels like to me.
Yep. I don't know if he's sort of weathered and like a bit, I don't know, like I don't know if he's handsome or rumpled. Mm-hmm. I could see either. I sort of feel like because he's got the two girlfriends, which suggests maybe handsome, but also just like, you know, it's Eastern Europe, you got to take what you can get. So maybe rumpled, you know. I'm not 100% sure, but
he's not
it's
Matt.
Fun, it's
he's
fun
not
to
Matt
think about.
Damon. We'll say that.
No, he's not. He's not Matt Damon. No, Matt Damon now could maybe do it though. Like the now Matt Damon. He's certainly not 20 years ago Matt Damon.
I do think the Bourne movies do have a kinship here. Like, no, not the. I mean, the thing with the Bourne movies is that like the spy tech is never really that over the top. Like we're never in this like place of it. Like the Bourne movies are very analog when you get down to them. You know, it's a pretty desperate world, and I felt a real, and especially the way that, you know, the fights are choreographed in at least the ones that Greenglass directed. The fights in the Bourne movies are confusing, and like you're never quite sure where you are, and they seem really nasty and blurry and all that stuff.
So also like Christopher Nolan from the same period, same idea.
Yeah.
Just snap, 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 cut, 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 pop, 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 grunt, grunt, somebody's on the ground. Right. You know, like,
you know, they're vicious. You know, a magazine gets used as a lethal weapon, a rolled up magazine at one point. And that this world feels like that world, you know, like nothing really works the way that it's supposed to. And it's a world of like, you're never sure what's going to happen next because like the metaphysics are really at play. Which, you know, like regardless of my feelings of like, gosh, he just keeps returning to a sounding board to get his plot out. And I really wish that it was capitalism all along, though I really do agree with you that I think with a writer of clearly this talent and this brain power that he is pulling the rug out from under us. I think you're right. That's a great point. I still really love this. Like I am like, holy crap. I like this world. I like this idea. I just wish I had a little more. I had to read page 225 to 275, like 4 or 5 times.
I still can't quite make out what the relationship between Siren Core and the ultra-nationalist was. It was something like muscle, but that was confusing. And I still don't quite understand the significance of the filing cabinets. And I also read those things. Things just kind of, and it did feel to me like, it felt to me like China Miéville had a lot of fun with the conspiratorial setup and with the scenario. And then about 2/3 of the way through the book and Breach, all the things that I found fun. And then he was just like, okay, I got to get to it with capitalism all along. Let's just like drag Borlu on a shield through a bunch of stuff that gets us there. And it didn't feel like he was particularly enjoying it. It didn't pop. You know, there's some interesting observations about who sees Breach and who doesn't and who, but at that point it's starting to feel like old hat. You know, I mean, the new thing here is Borlu seeing the world as Breach, and that's kind of interesting. That was really the only thing I found interesting in the second half. And I don't know. It's a dilemma to me because, as I said earlier, I think China Miéville has the right to pull the rug out from under us. What's the point of being a writer if you can't build a beautiful world and then impose your worldview on the readers through how you manipulate the world? Like that's the whole game, right? But you still. Oh, go ahead.
Well, and also just like what you just said makes me think of like very in keeping with the nature of the novel. You know, so it's like, okay, like even though I am dissatisfied, I see why it can make sense in this way. That like, and especially when we get some of those passages from Sear or Coke, whoever the bad guy is that's talking, when he talks about like how ridiculous the rest of the world thinks that Olcoma and Bejel are. And so you're like, okay, I can see this as a giant metaphor for like ways of thinking that become that a large number of people adhere to, but then also become sort of incestuous. where the idea begins to perpetuate the idea, and you can see this whole Begel-Olcoma thing as like, oh, we like 50 years ago, they just needed to be like, stop.
Well, and also that a reality that can exist in one context can be completely absurd and irrelevant in another context.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think I don't know, I've had experience of traveling to, and this is like a kind of white privilege, like as a white person in Tanzania, where like the cops have tried to intimidate me, and I've just been like, come on.
Yeah.
You know, and that come on is sort of like, well, I'm an American, and like, you don't want to mess with my embassy. Yeah. You know, and I know that, and I'm extremely confident in that. And who knows, like that might not even be true. But I think if you project that kind of confidence to police in a developing country, most of the time they'll back off. Now, I have not lived to see the 1 time in 10 it doesn't work, but like my Tanzanian friends are like, oh my god, this is terrifying, you know, like you're standing up to the people who could like throw us into jail, you know. And I'm just like, whatever, they're not going to throw me into a Tanzanian jail. Like my State Department would like not only like come and get me, but whoever did that would be like fired and fed to dogs, you know, if that happened. I mean, that's sort of my closest version of it. And it is a kind of arrogant white privilege thing, you know, that I internalized in those moments. I think sometimes if you're traveling, that can be a useful survival tactic, is to throw off that kind of arrogance. But I do think there are equivalents to it. And there are equivalents to like, oh, this hierarchy that exists in this particular place like means nothing to us over here. Or think about academia, right? You know, and like how important, you know, I mean, tenure is important because that's your ability to make your living, but how important like publication in a journal is, or which committee you went on, or and outside of academia, all of that stuff means nothing. It's sort of laughable. Yeah. And so I think he's gesturing at that too, the way in which what becomes such a part of people's world, and I think it happens probably in your athletic world too, you know, where results and rankings and things like that become extremely meaningful in a particular context, and so meaningful it's not. I don't think it would work for Olcoma and Bezel to say, "Come on, let's come off it." Right. Like the you know, breach is really more or less invisible until you can see them. Well, and unseeing is real.
We get a version of, we see what happens when the system breaks down, and it's not good. Yep. It's like it's a 2 city-wide riot where like all of a sudden nobody knows who is in the same space as them, and you really get to see like society kind of break down.
No, those rules are they provide structure for these people.
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I think, you know, the echo chambers of like our political moment are another really like you get so tied in to the belief structures of your particular tribe that, you know, everything else seems literally unseeable or unapprehendable, or like I'm not even going to talk to those people, and that's a problem.
Yeah. And also that so many of the norms that govern us, they might be useful, but they are, you know, breach's authority is actually extremely thin. Yeah. You know, it's everything breach can do to sort of contain this riot, and really they can't, you know, at first. And they're spread very, very thin, and their tactics are basically like, they seem to be trained in a kind of like breach martial art.
Yeah, they've got like a that is very effective going on or something like that.
Yeah, and they do that, and they intimidate people. You know, and I mean, you know, Shiel, we see him intimidating people, and it's very effective. You know, he faces down those soldiers, and they're pointing their guns at him, and he's telling them to stand down, and like the soldiers could easily shoot him and nothing would happen to them. Yep. You know, they would get away with it. But because they're Bejel, they have been trained, you know, not to mess with breach. And it's very, very difficult for them in that moment. And I think, you know, China Miéville is also commenting on the fragility of the structures that govern us too. And, you know, one wonders I don't know. I don't think he's making a master argument here. I read that he wrote this novel when his mother, I think his mother was sick or dying, as a gift to her because her favorite genre was detective noir or detective fiction. So he chose to breach genre. And so I think that's part of it, is that he's playing with the conventions a little bit, and he's doing it in a kind of weird way.
Yeah. And, and I'm just like, I'm so happy to have read this. I'm so happy to have experienced this, because I really do think, like, books this inventive are rare.
Yeah. I completely agree. And like, I do feel like there is a little bit of a letdown in the second half. Part of the reason there's a bit of a letdown is what he establishes, and not even the second half. It's like the final third.
Yeah.
It's not even the final third. It's like
quarter.
The final half.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's like the final quarter. Because even the first part of the breach section I found great. But I think part of that, weird. Battery's running low. Okay. I think I wasn't plugged in, but now I am. The funny thing about that is that the reason for that, I think, is that what he built up was so wonderful, and sometimes it's just hard to match that. It's hard to give it. Although there is a part of me that wonders, like, what if we had actually been brought into was inside the ancient war between Orsini and Breach?
That's what I want. Like that is what I want.
So, are you on record? Do you really think that would be the better book than what we got?
Yes, I do. Reading the final, let's see, what is 1/2 of 1/3, 1/6 of the book. In some ways it made me really appreciate Neil Stephenson's narrative control. I don't need to read Cryptonomicon again for probably another 10 years or so. As frustrated as you and I were with the, like, oh my God, we're really going to spend another 70 pages on X? Like, you never lose the thread of Cryptonomicon. And that's because Stephenson is very precise. Even as he's knocking chess pieces down, he is tipping them over.
We're always getting one step closer to the gold.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, exactly. And as a piece of political writing and as a piece of, like, anthropological, like you said last time, you're like, this is much less of a crime novel and much more of a piece of anthropological. Can you remember the
sci-fi?
Sci-fi.
Like,
that's right. Yes. Anthropological sci-fi. If we're in anthropological sci-fi, it's great. He nails it. Perfect job. Yes, it was capitalism all along. But I spend most of my life thinking that it's capitalism all along. Like, that's sort of like my thing. And I was like, oh, he's better than, and again, like, I agree with you that yes, it is his book, and moving around your reader's emotions in ways that they maybe don't enjoy is a very powerful and respectable authorial thing. But, like, I felt like we were on this trajectory of just amazing imagination. And for me, the trajectory just kind of leveled off. And I was like, oh, it's just a police procedural? Like, darn it. I don't know if it would be the better book. I would have enjoyed that book more.
You would have enjoyed that book more. All right. I have one more question for you, and I'm going to set it up with a reading.
Cool.
So this is the very last 2 paragraphs of the novel. That is the end of the case of Orsini and the archaeologists, and the last case of Inspector Theodore Borlu of the Bezzel Extreme Crime Squad. Inspector Theodore Borlu is gone. I sign off Ty, avatar of Breach, following my mentor, on my probation, out of Bezzel, and out of Ulcoma. We are all philosophers here. We are all philosophers here where I am, and we debate, among many other things, the question of where it is that we live. On that issue, I am a liberal. I live in the interstice, yes, but I live in both the city and the city. first of all, I liked it. Good ending. You're giving us the double thumbs up. Second of all, noir usually ends with a ambivalent ending for the protagonist.
Yep.
Is this a happy ending for Borlu or a sad ending for Borlu, or a tragic ending?
I think it is. I think it is ambivalent. I think it is bittersweet. Like he is the thing that we have seen out of Borlu is that he is a really good detective.
Yes.
And we know that Breach doesn't have a lot of detectives. And so we mourn in this paragraph, Inspector Theodore Borlu is gone. Like that phase is past. And oh my gosh, just these final sentences. We are all philosophers here where I am, and we debate among many other things the question of where it is that we live. You could end a lot of books with that sentence. And it's a very simple sentence. And I love that he gives us this final puzzle of what it means to be a liberal in this particular setting. I think it means that liberals recognize that there are two cities, and perhaps conservatives believe something else. But that there is this mixing of Breach and Bejel and Olcoma. And I think that's what he is saying about being liberal in his belief systems here. I think it's a great final paragraph. I think it opens back up into the wild possibilities of most of the book.
I agree. And I also think it ends as a piece of noir should too, with an ambivalent end for the detective. And I interpret liberal not in today's liberal and conservative sense, but in the classical sense of the world, meaning expansive, generous of thought, and conservative in the traditional sense of the world, as in narrow in thought
and status quo.
And status quo, and subscribing to precise definitions. And what he's saying is it's possible to be both in Breach and in Olcoma and in Bejel all at the same time. And, that's his point of view. And so in that sense, Inspector Theodore Borlu is not gone. He is still with us. He carries his past. He can still, see Corwy at the bench, and she sort of waves goodbye to him, and he has a kind of goodbye with Dot. And even though they have to pretend like they don't see him, they do see him. Yeah. And he is still sort of in their life, as it were. I think it's a nice ending. And I actually will say, if it's one of those things where, I hate to be put into a box, and if you forced me to say whether this is anthropological science fiction or noir, I guess I'd have to go with anthropological science fiction. But like Borlu, I would rather be a liberal and say it is both anthropological science fiction and noir. Yeah. And it does a really good job being both things.
Yeah, I think this is a wildly successful novel that I just wish a different choice had been made in the final 65 pages of the book. And that's great. Way to go.
Yeah. You're allowed to wish that. I mean, I'm also wondering if he could have his way, but it did. I wonder if he could have done that in a way that felt also fascinating. It did almost sort of feel like he was just okay, now I got to wrap things up. So let's just go do it. And maybe he could have relished those subplots, the Siren Core more, or something like that.
Yeah, it really says something that I felt like I was. If the film that came to mind was Lethal Weapon 2, then yes, excellent movies, but we've fallen off a bit from last time when I was I feel like I'm reading Raymond Chandler crossed with Franz Kafka.
Yeah. There are moments in Lethal Weapon 2 where the character's investigation is kind of stuck, and then just a helicopter comes and tries to kill them. Yeah. And, that's what moves the plot to the next thing too, which is this book doesn't do that exactly.
The helicopter gets away. It doesn't even blow up.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a reverse Deus Ex Machina. It's almost like Devil Ex Machina, you know,
and
like that.
The devil being capitalism, you know, and like he's always here.
He's always here. I'm ready to go to trivia.
Yeah, me too.
If you are,
yeah, I am. Who is the host?
I think it flipped with Red Harvest, so
Okay.
I think I am now the host.
Okay.
I think. Does that sound right? I forgive me, reader, if I'm wrong.
It doesn't even have to be right. It simply has to be decisive.
Just has to be decisive. So, China Miéville often refers to his genre not as sci-fi, not as fantasy, not as urban fantasy, but as neo-weird or the new weird fiction. And the original term, weird fiction, was a term used in the late 19th and early 20th century. And that term it's one of those cases where the term for a literary movement was actually coined by one of its practitioners. So, was the writer who coined the term weird fiction A, Ambrose Bierce, B, Bram Stoker, or C, H.P. Lovecraft?
H.P. Lovecraft.
Correct.
Yes. Who's the first one?
Ambrose Bierce.
Yeah, I don't know that name.
Oh, really? I'm surprised. He wrote An Encounter at Owl Creek Bridge. He was kind of a surrealist writer, contemporary of Poe's.
Cool.
Yeah, I mean, he could have coined the term, and he was considered a practitioner of it or a forerunner of it. Like less like monsters, more sort of like character. I mean, that story, Encounter at Owl Creek Bridge, is the inspiration for Brazil.
Wow. Cool.
In which a character is about to die and then hallucinates his rescue in like the moment that. Well, I don't want to give too much away.
Sounds great.
But yeah. So he was experimenting with like time's passage, dreams, hallucination, all in like the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. Yeah, I'm surprised you don't know.
Yeah.
I'm going to read a great quote from H.P. Lovecraft.
Please do, yeah.
The true weird tale has something more than secret murder, bloody bones, or a sheeted form clanking chains according to rule. A certain atmosphere of breathless and unexplainable dread of outer unknown forces must be present, and there must be a hint, expressed with a seriousness and portentousness becoming its subject, of that most terrible conception of the human brain, a malign and particular suspension or defeat of those fixed laws of nature, which are our only safeguard against the assaults of chaos and the demons of unplumbed space.
Yeah, we're back in the sublime, you know?
We are, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and we're going to read Dracula in a few months, and that perfectly describes Dracula.
Yeah. Oh gosh, if only H.P. Lovecraft weren't so weren't such a dickhead. But
I read a lot of people there were a number of people who praised this essay while saying they don't like reading Lovecraft. And I would include myself
excellent
in
writer.
that.
I mean, like those turns of phrase that you just read are great.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm not, and I haven't read much of him, but everything, it just feels like it's like tentacles and dark closets and horrific moods and that kind of thing. Like Poe on acid, basically.
Okay.
Which may literally be true. Well, no, it's not literally true. It may be somewhat true.
That'd be great. I would be so happy if that were the case. But if H.P. Lovecraft were just Edgar Allan Poe on acid with like this like fantastic PR not actually a very bad PR campaign, but if instead of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, it's Dr. Poe and Mr. Lovecraft, that kind of thing.
Yeah, like somehow, like maybe they had a formulation of acid that would also revive Poe from the grave.
Yeah, totally.
A new human.
Okay, there are many, many examples in the world of cities split by borders, but none as inconvenient as the two cities in this book, Bajel and Ulcoma. Which of the following European cities comes closest due to geography or sociopolitical stuff or whatnot? But
Okay.
so option A, Budapest, a portmanteau and physical conjoining of Buda and Pest, two ancient cities on either side of the Danube River. B, Barl Hertog in Belgium and Barl Nassau, which are two municipalities in the Netherlands where 22 Belgian enclaves exist, sometimes necessitating border dashes literally painted onto the street. So you know that you're in Barla Hertog versus Barla Nassau. Mm-hmm. Or Berlin, where vestiges of the old divide between East and West are still visible and, in some cases, still celebrated.
Well, I think that A and C are both true, but not particularly inconvenient. I think that Buda and Pest are two ancient cities, but there's a river and there's a couple of bridges. I think that there are still some divides between East Berlin and West Berlin, but the wall was the biggest one, and that one's down. So I don't think it's that difficult. And yes, there are still some memorials, but I don't think they're inconvenient. And you know, I'm somewhat familiar between the border of Belgium and the Netherlands, and I sort of remember a detail like that occurring in a Neil Stevenson novel describing that area too. And so I can't rename the names of the two cities that I assume are like on opposite sides of a river or something like that have almost but not quite the same name. But that sounds right to me, so I'm going with B.
You are correct. And they are not even on the sides of a river. They do literally share the same space. The map is bananas.
Wow.
It is like, there's like the Netherlands, there's the Hertog, there's the Barla Nassau, which is sort of the bigger municipality. And then Barla Hertog looks like a bunch of city squares that are just scattered throughout the other city.
But I suspect it's okay to pass between them without a passport.
Yeah. Right. But there are like, it looks like the Asterix and Obelix books where, you know, like the border between France and Germany is just this painted white line that like a Roman like centurion is
Gaul was divided
at.
into three regions, actually 4. Right. Yeah, exactly. No, that makes a lot of sense. And, you know, my family is Luxembourgish, and when visiting them, we would sometimes just pop out to Belgium to go to the grocery store, and people think nothing of it. You know, there's no checkpoints in Benelux. You know, you just drive or take a bus or whatever between those countries.
I just texted you the article. The picture in the front is a series of those a borderline that appears to bisect somebody's front door.
That's hilarious. My phones are charging around the corner, so I'll look at
you
it
can
when
enjoy
I get
that
up.
later. So next up.
Whoa, Chris Bagg. Nope. Yeah. Chris Bagg, are you going to read this? Are you going to read this book again?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Oh hell yeah.
Yeah. Oh hell yeah. This is gonna like I would love to. Just like, I really do want to take another crack again at pages 225 to 275. But I also just want to like wander around Bejel again. Like I really liked Bejel. It had just this sort of like down at the heel kind of thing, and I dug it.
I'm more of an old coma man myself. I think I'll read it again too, even though I think for this taping I read it twice, and I had read it about 10 years ago. Because it's so intricate, and although my prediction for you is that section won't get any better, based as somebody who's now read that section 3 times and then had to go back and read sections of it a few more times, but who knows? But I just love. We talked about this last time, but the building of how you realize the premise and how the information about it is dribbled and drabbled out in the midst of what would be probably like a pretty entertaining detective novel anyway. Maybe not amazing, but certainly something you wouldn't mind reading in an airplane, you know, like, or, you know, if you had a few hours to kill and it was sitting there next to you, you pick it up and read it and be like, oh, it's kind of interesting, this Eastern European city without the premise of the city in the city. So I think I will too, although I might wait a decade or so. I'm just so pleased to have experienced it.
Well, next up, we are going to read James S.A. Corey's first book of the Expanse series is what it's called now because of the TV show. I don't think it was called that always, but Leviathan Wakes is book 1.
Well, everybody, thank you so much for listening. Upper Middle Brow is a Small Point production. Chris Bagg and Jesse Dukes are the avatars of Upper Middle Brow. Music by Ben Pajak and Jesse Dukes. Design and website by Chris Bagg. We are supported by Jenny Grieve and Justin Reich. And officially, if we add 3 more patrons between now and the end of January, we will do a shirtless video podcast taping. Don't ask me where that idea came from, but we said we're going to do it, so we'll do it if we can get those 3 patrons. You have between now and the end of January. This is probably coming out in mid-January.
As a reminder, along with being Polish AF, Jesse and I are both writers and editors and can help you with your writing, podcasting, or editing project. We would love to help you with those things. You can see some of our portfolios and learn more at our respective websites, chrisbag.com and jessedukes.com. Or
also check to see if Polish AF is available. Hot tip.
I'm restraining myself from doing that right now. Or you can enroll as a patron at the You Really, Really Like Us tier, which includes some one-on-one editorial time with one of us or the other, or both. But we would love to work with you.
We'll make sure that your manuscript is polished AF.
Nice. Not just Polish
I don't know if
AF.
that's particularly funny. He who would pun would pick a pocket.
He who puns last puns longest.